Hey, John Gilroy here. I'd like to give you some ideas on how to become a guest on a podcast. By now, everyone knows that getting a slot on a podcast is a great way to promote your own podcast, but very few people know the details of how to become a guest. Okay, let's look at 6 tactics you can use to become a guest on a podcast. Number 1, start off by making a list of 20 target podcasts. In 2019, Google started indexing and ranking podcasts. This means it's easier than ever to find the name of a podcast that includes your target audience. For example, let's look at podcasts on cybersecurity, or podcasts on civil engineering, or podcasts on aerospace. So you can fill in the blank with whatever your topic happens to be. Now you can amplify this by going to Apple Podcasts. On the bottom of every listing, they'll give you examples of similar type podcasts. So create a spreadsheet where you have the company name, the podcast, and the website. Number 2, find the name of the moderator. I would say about 80% of company podcasts should be on Apple Podcasts. We mentioned it earlier. This presence will give you the name of the website that hosts the podcast. With luck, you can get the name of the moderator from there. If it's not listed there, then listen carefully to the opening. Normally, the person will give their name. So jot down that name and try some sample spellings. LinkedIn is a great place to find names for a business-to-business podcast. Okay, you can kind of flip it, and you can reverse this technique by starting with the name itself. For example, the RSA conference this year had 2,700 speakers. I would guess that about half of those speakers have a podcast on cybersecurity. So why not type in the person's name and see if they have a podcast, Joe Smith Podcast, just to see if they're listed. So you can get the name there. So get your spreadsheet out. Now you have the moderator's name. Number 3, understand the audience. Listen to a few episodes to get the feel for the style of the podcast. Does it appeal to the scientific community, rather serious? Does it have serious guests on, How long is the podcast? 25 minutes, 30 minutes? How often does the moderator do a solo, and how often does he have a guest? What is common about the guests? Find out what kind of a guest has a good rapport with the moderator, and you can use that to emulate it for your approach. Number 4, get the email for the moderator. Once you have the moderator's name and website for the company, then you can use publicly available tools to find the email and fill in the spreadsheet. Dozens of these tools are available. I have used services like Voila, Norbert, and Hunter. They're very popular. Number 5, create a personalized email. You have to spend some time with this. What we're going to do here is we're going to assemble all the information from our outreach and put it into a real good email. So draft an email that does not look like a canned message, Use the specific name of the podcast in the subject line, and you may want to take a screenshot of the show notes page or a screenshot of their appearance on Apple Podcasts and include that in the body of the email. What you want to do is when you listen to the podcast, what you want to do is you want to mirror the tone of the podcast with the tone of the email. For example, if it's a serious podcast, you may want to open with something like investing in space is always challenging. Okay, if you have a more lighthearted podcast, you might want to start off with something like, you always end your podcast with a question. This is the time of the show where we ask you what the last book was that you read. Well, the last book I read was Gabriel by well-known cyber expert Dr. Chase Cunningham. Would love to appear on your podcast to talk about the current rash of ransomware. So mirror the tone of the podcast in the email. A little bit more about the email. What you want to do is you try to use some kind of a specific quote or a fact or figure in there. Let's talk about ransomware because I know a little bit about it. You could say something like the U.S. Department of Treasury found around $590 million has been paid in ransomware in the first 6 months of 2021. So that's a nice little fact that can give all of your pitch much more resonance. So another way to prove your competence in the email is to link to a previous podcast appearance. You can say something like, hey, Brian, I recorded over 50 podcasts about cybersecurity. Here's a link to my most recent interview. All this means is that you can speak in front of a microphone. It's going to make the producer much more relaxed. Finally, with a cold email, I like to have a very strong SIG file, maybe with your photo in it, maybe with some of your accomplishments. All this indicates is that this isn't a piece of spam. This is a real human being that can help my podcast. Number 6, leverage that appearance. Why bother to get on someone's podcast unless it doesn't bring value to your company? Start with communicating with the producer to find out what kind of call to action you can include in your interview. Now, the most accepted format is at the end of the interview, the moderator will turn to you and say, well, tell me, Rohan, how can listeners get a hold of you? Well, that's your opportunity to use a website or a LinkedIn presence or something like that. Now, please remember that many people listening to podcasts aren't sitting in their room, in their office listening. They may be out in their cars, they may be jogging. So what you want to do is you have to have some way to have them remember your company name. Now, I have dealt with companies with names like Click, with names like Centura, names like Xagility. These are wonderful, profitable companies, but hard to say when the listener is literally on the run. One approach I've used is to create an ear-friendly website. So what's an ear-friendly website? I've used howtopromotapodcast.com very effectively. For example, the moderator may turn to me and say, well, John, how can people find more information about your company? My response would be, well, it's very simple. You can go to howtopromotapodcast.com and register for the free webinar. It's great. So that's just a simple way to leverage your appearance on a podcast. Appearing as a guest on a podcast is a powerful way to promote your own podcast. However, setting up this contact requires a kind of a step-by-step approach. Develop a list of targets, find out who the moderator is, then listen to the tone and vocabulary of the interviews and try to mirror that in your communication. Know the rules of the game. Develop a call to action that the producer and moderator will accept, and also a way that the listener can get a hold of you very easily. From there, it's your job to develop a relationship with the listener. I hope everyone watching this gets more downloads for their podcast. My name is John Gilroy. The next time you see a microphone, go forth and podcast.